Welcome to Rise and Shine. Our story is The Summit Within, a story of one man's spiritual journey to reclaim purpose by climbing a towering mountain. Join Lucas as he faces the challenges of both nature and his own soul, seeking inner peace. So close your eyes and take a deep breath, and let's begin. Chapter 1. The Call to Climb. The sun dipped low over the horizon, bathing the world in hues of orange and pink. Lucas stood on the porch of his small cabin, overlooking the valley that stretched for miles before him. The cabin, nestled in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, had been his refuge for years, a place of solace after leaving the relentless pace of city life. But now, even the quiet of nature couldn't silence the restlessness that gnawed at his soul. Lucas had always been an ambitious man, once a high-powered executive who moved through life with precision and determination. But somewhere along the way, after climbing the corporate ladder, making the money, and securing a life that many would envy, he found himself adrift. Success had come with a price, and that price was meaning. The things that once gave him purpose began to feel hollow. In the quiet of the mountains, he sought peace, but instead found a void. For months, Lucas wrestled with this feeling of loss. He tried yoga, meditation, reading self-help books, anything that might give him a clue as to what was missing. He took long walks through the woods, letting nature embrace him, hoping to hear some whisper of wisdom in the rustling leaves or the songs of birds. But none of it seemed to help. Then one day, as he stood on a cliff overlooking the valley, he noticed a towering peak far in the distance, the highest in the range. It seemed to rise above everything, almost touching the sky. Something stirred inside him as he gazed at the mountain, a deep yearning he hadn't felt in years. He wanted to climb it, not just for the physical challenge, though that was certainly part of it, but because the mountain seemed to call to something within him. The peak, so high and distant, felt like a metaphor for his life. There was something more out there, something he needed to reach. It was as if the mountain promised answers, but only if he had the strength to claim them. Lucas made the decision right then and there. He would climb that mountain. He would reach the summit, not just to conquer the peak, but to rediscover himself along the way. Chapter 2. Preparation. The next few weeks were filled with preparation. Lucas was no stranger to physical challenges. He had run marathons in the past, dabbled in triathlons, and even done some rock climbing in his youth. But this mountain was different. It was not a trail that hikers casually meandered up on weekends. It was rugged, remote, and dangerous. He gathered maps, studied the terrain, and scoured forums online to find information from others who had attempted the climb. The mountain was known for its unpredictability, rapidly changing weather, treacherous paths, and difficult to navigate boulder fields. Few people attempted it, and even fewer succeeded. Undeterred, Lucas began training. He pushed his body harder than he had in years. Early mornings found him running along the trails behind his cabin, building his endurance. Afternoons were spent at the gym, strengthening his core and legs. preparing for the strain of climbing. Evenings were devoted to research, learning about the best equipment, the most effective climbing techniques, and the potential dangers he would face. Friends and family thought he was crazy. "You're not young anymore, Lucas," they would say, concern etched on their faces. "What if something happens? Why do you need to do this?" Lucas didn't have an answer that satisfied them. He couldn't fully explain why he felt this need to climb the mountain. All he knew was that he had to do it. There was something at the summit, something he couldn't name but knew he needed to find. As the weeks passed, he became leaner, stronger, and more focused. His body transformed, but so did his mind. The doubts and fears that had plagued him for so long began to fade, replaced by a quiet determination. The mountain loomed ever larger in his thoughts, not as an obstacle, but as an opportunity. Finally, after months of preparation, the day came. Lucas packed his gear meticulously: ropes, carabiners, crampons, a sleeping bag, a tent, food, and water. He double-checked everything, then checked it again. He wasn't leaving anything to chance. He knew the journey would take days, perhaps even weeks, depending on the weather and the conditions of the climb. But he was ready, or as ready as he would ever be. The morning of his departure was crisp and cool, the sky painted in soft shades of dawn. Lucas stood at the foot of the mountain, gazing up at its towering presence. He could feel the weight of the climb ahead of him, both physically and spiritually. With a deep breath, he took his first step. Chapter 3. The Ascent. The first few days of the climb were exhilarating. The air was fresh and invigorating, the forest thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Lucas moved steadily, finding a rhythm as he hiked along the lower trails. The pack on his back was heavy, but his body was strong, and he relished the challenge of each step. As he ascended higher, the terrain began to change. The forest thinned, replaced by rocky slopes and steep inclines. The air grew colder, and the wind picked up, whipping through the crevices of the mountain. Lucas found himself having to navigate more carefully, choosing his steps with precision as the paths became narrower and more treacherous. But with each step, he felt a growing sense of purpose. The climb wasn't just about reaching the summit anymore. It was about something deeper. It was about pushing himself beyond his limits, testing his strength and resolve. It was about confronting the doubts and fears that had plagued him for so long. On the fourth day, as he made his way across a particularly steep ridge, a storm rolled in. The sky darkened, and the wind howled, threatening to tear him from the mountain. He found shelter in a small cave, setting up his tent and hunkering down as rain and sleet battered the outside world. For hours he sat in the tent, listening to the storm rage around him. He thought about turning back, about the safety of his cabin and the comfort of the life he had left behind. But as the storm continued to lash at the mountain, something shifted within him. He realized that the storm wasn't just outside. It was inside him as well. The doubts, the fears, the sense of loss and directionlessness. They were the storm he had been battling for years. And just like the storm outside, he couldn't control them. All he could do was weather them, hold steady, and wait for the skies to clear. The storm eventually passed, and Lucas emerged from his shelter, tired but resolute. He had made it through the worst of it, and in doing so, he had found a new strength within himself. The mountain was testing him, but he was ready for whatever came next. As he continued his ascent, the terrain became more challenging. The slopes were steeper, the air thinner, and the paths more treacherous. But Lucas moved with a quiet determination, his mind focused on the climb. Each step brought him closer to the summit, but more importantly, each step brought him closer to himself. Chapter 4. Alone on the Mountain. The higher Lucas climbed, the more isolated he became. The trees had long since disappeared, replaced by jagged rocks and snow-covered slopes. The air was thin, making each breath a struggle, and the wind seemed to howl with an almost eerie intensity. But it wasn't just the physical isolation that Lucas felt. The mountain was stripping away everything that had once defined him. His job, his relationships, his sense of who he was. Up here, none of that mattered. There were no distractions, no noise, no expectations. It was just him and the mountain. At first, the solitude was unsettling. Lucas had always been someone who thrived on activity and accomplishment. In the city, he had been surrounded by people, always moving from one task to the next, always pushing for more. But here, there was nothing to push against, except himself. As the days passed, Lucas began to embrace the solitude. It was in the quiet moments, when the only sound was the crunch of his boots on the snow, or the distant cry of an eagle, that he began to hear the voice within him. It wasn't a loud voice, but a quiet whisper, urging him forward. One afternoon, as he rested on a small ledge, Lucas found himself gazing out over the vast expanse of the mountain range. The view was breathtaking. Endless peaks stretching out as far as the eye could see, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. For the first time in a long time, Lucas felt a deep sense of peace. In that moment, he realized that the climb wasn't about reaching the summit. It was about the journey itself. The mountain was teaching him that life wasn't about the destination. It was about the steps along the way. Each challenge, each moment of doubt, each moment of triumph, they were all part of the journey. Lucas closed his eyes and took a deep breath, letting the cold mountain air fill his lungs. He was still far from the summit, but it didn't matter. He was exactly where he needed to be. Chapter 5. The Final Push. After nearly 2 weeks of climbing, Lucas found himself nearing the summit. The air was painfully cold now, each breath a sharp reminder of how high he had climbed. The path was no longer clear, and he had to navigate carefully through ice fields and treacherous slopes. Despite the exhaustion that weighed on him, Lucas felt a renewed sense of determination. The summit was within reach, and with it, the answers he had been seeking. On the morning of his final push, Lucas woke to a clear sky, the sun casting a brilliant light over the snow-covered peak. He packed up his gear, tightened his boots, and began the climb. The path was steep, almost vertical in places, and his muscles screamed with every step. But Lucas pressed on, driven by a force he couldn't fully explain. As he neared the top, the wind picked up, howling through the rocks and sending chills down his spine. The summit was so close now, just a few 100 feet away. He could see it, feel it calling to him. With one final burst of energy, Lucas pulled himself up over the last ridge and onto the summit. He stood there, breathless, gazing out at the world below. The view was indescribable, endless mountains and valleys stretching out in every direction. The sky so vast and clear that it felt like he could reach out and touch it. But it wasn't the view that moved him. It was the silence. Up here, at the top of the world, there was nothing but silence. No noise, no distractions, no expectations. Just pure, unbroken stillness. And in that stillness, Lucas found what he had been searching for all along. It wasn't a grand revelation or a sudden epiphany. It was something much simpler, much quieter. It was the realization that he didn't need to climb mountains to find meaning. He didn't need to push himself to bigger and better things. Everything he needed was already within him. Lucas sat down on the edge of the summit, letting the silence wash over him. For the first time in years, he felt truly at peace. The mountain hadn't given him the answers. It had simply helped him find them within himself. As he sat there, gazing out at the endless expanse of the world below, Lucas knew that his journey wasn't over. He would continue to climb, continue to seek, continue to grow. But he would do so with a new sense of purpose, a purpose that came not from external achievements, but from within. The mountain had shown him the way, but the real summit was the one he had found within himself. And as Lucas began his descent, he carried that knowledge with him, knowing that no matter where life took him, he would always have the strength to climb. Chapter 6. The Descent. Descending the mountain was a wholly different experience from the climb. The exhilaration of reaching the summit had been replaced by a quiet calm, a peaceful resignation that he was now walking back into the life he had left behind. The weight of his pack no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it felt light, almost as if he had shed a part of himself on the mountain. Lucas took his time on the way down, stopping often to take in the view and reflect on the journey. He felt no rush to return to the world below. Up here, in the rarefied air, he had found something precious, an understanding of himself that had eluded him for years. There was no hurry to leave that behind. But as the days passed and the terrain became easier, Lucas began to think about his return. He wondered what awaited him at the bottom of the mountain. Would he be the same person who had left? Would the world look different to him? He didn't know, but he was no longer afraid of the uncertainty. On the 8th day of his descent, Lucas reached the forested lower slopes of the mountain. The air was warmer here, the ground softer underfoot. Birds sang in the trees, and the scent of pine filled the air. It felt strange to be back in this familiar world, after so many days in the harsh, silent heights of the mountain. As he walked, Lucas thought about the life he had left behind, the job, the relationships, the endless pursuit of success. He had spent so many years chasing after something, but he now realized that he didn't even know what that something was. The mountain had stripped away all the noise and distractions, leaving only the essentials, and in that clarity, he had found peace. Lucas knew that his life would be different now. He didn't need to chase after success or validation from others. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone, least of all himself. What he needed was to live with purpose, to be present in each moment, to appreciate the beauty and simplicity of life. As the cabin came into view, nestled among the trees at the edge of the valley, Lucas felt a deep sense of gratitude. The mountain had given him more than he could have ever imagined. It had given him himself. Chapter 7. A New Beginning. Back at the cabin, life resumed its familiar rhythms. The days passed in quiet simplicity, chopping wood, tending the garden, reading by the fire. But something had shifted within Lucas. He no longer felt restless or lost. The mountain had grounded him, given him a sense of purpose that transcended the need for external achievements. He began to write, not with the intention of publishing or proving anything, but simply to capture his thoughts and experiences. The words flowed easily, a reflection of the peace he had found within himself. He wrote about the climb, the challenges, the moments of doubt and fear, and the quiet revelations that had come in the stillness of the mountain. In time, people began to seek him out. Friends and acquaintances who had heard about his journey came to the cabin, curious about what he had found on the mountain. They asked him for advice, for guidance, for wisdom. Lucas shared what he had learned, but he never claimed to have all the answers. The mountain had taught him that the answers were different for everyone, and that each person had to find their own path. Lucas continued to climb, though not always the physical mountains. He climbed the mountains within himself, pushing deeper into his own soul, seeking out the places where fear and doubt still lingered. And with each climb he grew stronger, more centered, more at peace. The mountain was always there, standing tall and silent on the horizon, a reminder of the journey he had taken. But Lucas no longer felt the need to conquer it. He had already reached the summit within himself, and that was enough. The end.